Russia is welcoming a European decision not to use frozen Russian assets for the financial support it's giving Ukraine. Several hours ago, EU officials announced a deal to provide more than $100 billion to Kyiv over the next 2 years. Claire Sebastian reports.
European leaders had promised that they would not leave this summit until they had a clear plan as to how to fund Ukraine through the next 2 years. And they kept that promise. In the early hours of Friday morning, after a marathon day of talks, they came to a deal. But it wasn't what some had hoped or even expected. The big focus coming into this was whether or not they would be able to use the cash balances from Russia's frozen assets here in Europe to fund a loan for Ukraine. They haven't managed to reach a deal on that. Instead, they're going to borrow on the capital markets, and that will be guaranteed by unspent funds in the EU budget. Either way, Ukraine will not have to pay this back until the war ends and Russia pays reparations. So European leaders here were keen to paint this as a win.
The message we are sending to Russia today is crystal clear. First, you have not achieved your objectives in Ukraine. Second, Europe stands with Ukraine today, tomorrow, and as long as necessary.
Had we left Brussels divided today, Europe would have walked away from geopolitical relevance. It would have been a total disaster.
So Europe has passed this test of its strength and unity. But this whole process did amplify divisions within the bloc, and it suddenly came down to the wire for Ukraine, which by the spring would be facing a cash crunch so large that its president, who was here today, President Zelensky, warned that it might even have to cut back on its critical drone production. That crisis, for now, seems to be averted, and Ukraine goes into the next phase of peace talks with the US in a stronger position. Claire Sebastian, CNN, in Brussels.
And for more on this, we're joined by Dominic Thomas, CNN European Affairs commentator. Good to see you again. So we heard there Belgium's Prime Minister saying they averted disaster. I mean, how close did this come to actually falling apart?
Well, I mean, in many ways, you could argue that what they were left with was sort of the remnants of what had fallen apart. You know, the goal has been to leverage this $250+ billion that has been immobilized or frozen since Russia expanded its invasion of Ukraine back in 2022. And the reality was they were unable to reach consensus over this because several EU member countries are concerned over the legalities of this. Some, like Hungary, are aligned in many ways with Russia. And so at the end of the day, I think really what they came up with, Kim, was a sort of a face-saving mechanism as the process and discussion around the peace negotiation moves forward. But I think that the idea that Russia is prepared to pay for the reconstruction of the war effort or to engage in reparations, which would essentially mean recognizing accountability, is a very, very long distance objective. So I think at best today, Kim, it was a face-saving exercise.
Yeah, even though, as we heard in that report, European leaders are painting this as a win, but so is Moscow. Why is that?
Well, I think that the writing's on the wall. I think on the heels of the release of the security vision of US foreign policy, that unfortunately is a document in many ways, the vision shared by Russia. I think that the signs and indications that Europe is struggling to find agreement when it comes to what supporting Ukraine will look like moving forward. The fact that the negotiations with Russia, the United States, and Europe have not taken part in a concerted manner at this stage, these divisions bolster Russians' power and influence precisely because the European Union body is unable at this particular juncture to stand up in a sort of concerted manner to its particular efforts. And I think it therefore weakens, by association, Ukraine's bid for a negotiated peace treaty moving forward here, Ken.
Interesting, though. President Zelensky has said without this kind of support, Ukraine's drone industry and its long-range strikes on Russian infrastructure would basically disappear. So does this deal give Kyiv at least what it needs to keep fighting?
Yeah, it allows them to remain on what we might say is a form of life support moving forward. It's a sustainable model in the short term. The problem is that the European desire to reach some kind of peace agreement that will be sustainable, that will include a deterrence for future Russian incursions is important. I think it allows them to kick the ball down the road a little bit more in terms of what the outcome of these negotiations would be. So it's a short-term treatment to try and make sure that Ukraine can withstand here, and but at the same time, not releasing these assets to Russia and placing pressure on them as well to continue to fund their war effort, knowing that $250 billion are tied up still in Europe and in a few other holding spots, Kim.
You had mentioned the Trump administration's peace plan. I mean, it called for using $100 billion of these frozen assets for U.S.-led reconstruction, with America taking half of the profits. I mean, how do you think that played into what Europeans eventually decided this week?
Well, I think that there's a deep realization that that relationship with the United States is at the very least going through a process of recalibration. President Trump is not a big supporter, as we know, of international organizations like the European Union, NATO even, and prefers to deal with countries on a sort of one-on-one, often in an asymmetrical way. But I think here that points out to the fact that in some ways, or in many ways, the US's objectives and goals of what would be a successful outcome to this war are not shared by Europe in this regard. And the question of territorial resource exploitation and so on and so forth complicate the issue for Europe, that is interested in a sustainable peace agreement in which Russia is held accountable for these incursions, and so that in moving forward, the peace treaty will make sure that Europe is not dealing with another invasion somewhere else in 6 months or a year or 2 years down the road.
We'll leave it there. Always appreciate your analysis. Dominic Thomas, thank you so much.
Melissa Bell is following more of those developments and joins us now from Paris. So where is that money then coming from, Melissa?
Well, these were marathon talks, 16 hours in all it took them, the European leaders, to thrash out this deal. In the end, not the preferred option of either Ursula von der Leyen, the Commission President, nor indeed the preferred option of the German Chancellor. They would have preferred for these frozen Russian assets to be used. Instead, Erica, it will be a joint EU debt, not funded by the whole 27, by the way, by 24 of them. 3 of them opted out, including Hungary. But this will be a loan backed by the bloc's common debt, the common budget, rather. So what that means is that Ukraine gets its financial lifeline. That is the big headline that's come out of it, some 90 billion euros that will be loaned. Essentially, this was a country whose coffers were expected to run dry by the spring of next year. So the pressure was on that some kind of solution could be found. And in the end, it was much to the relief, I think, of Europeans and Ukrainians. Meanwhile, of course, all eyes very much on what happens over the course of the weekend. We know that now in Miami we'll be meeting Kirill Dmitriev, the head of the Russia Sovereign Fund, with, we expect, Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff to continue those negotiations on the proposed peace plan. What we've been hearing, though, in the last few moments from Vladimir Putin in Moscow does not suggest any change of position on the Russian side, Erica, even as those emissaries prepare to meet in Miami. Remember, on the basis of that Ukrainian and European and American revised peace proposal, a 20-point peace plan now. We're waiting to hear what the Russians have to say about it. But listening to Vladimir Putin just now in what we expect to be another marathon press conference that you mentioned a moment ago, what we've heard is that he stands by his position of June last year, which essentially means the entirety of the Donbass coming back to Russia, and his insistence, Russian insistence rather, that there should be no NATO boots on the ground in Ukraine. Now, both of those things do not align with the latest draft of the peace plan as it will be presented to those Russian emissaries over the weekend in Miami. He's also just been speaking, the Russian leader, to video that was shot earlier this week. We saw President Zelensky make his way to Kupiansk. This is a frontline town, Erica, in the Kharkiv region that's been on the front line for much of the few years of the war by dint of its strategic location. President Zelensky made his way there earlier this week, standing within a mile of the Russian positions, and to prove the Ukrainian claims that they'd managed to take parts of the city back. We've just been hearing Vladimir Putin pour scorn on that, suggesting that Volodymyr Zelensky is an artist, and saying if you'd liberated the town, why then not come in? So no suggestion for the time being, Erica, either in the tone or in the substance, that Russia is in negotiating mood.
Yeah, certainly not. Melissa, really appreciate it. Thank you.